During the early 2000s, if you were a young girl, or you were raising a young girl, then you probably remember the Mermaids. Mermaids were all the rage, featuring heavily in toys, clothing, and media marketed to young girls. The 90s, of course, had The Little Mermaid, but this fascination seemed to only balloon into the 2000s. You may recall the movie Aquamarine, the Barbie movie Mermaidia, or the TV show H2O, Just Add Water. As the title suggests, H2O is a show about a group of high school girls who turn into mermaids anytime they make contact with water. And it is delightfully riddled with plot holes. How do they stay hydrated? How do they brush their teeth? No one knows. This was coupled with the ascendance of surf brands like Roxy, Billabong, and O'Neill, who were making not just practical gear for surfers, but also fashionable surfer girl attire that could be worn at the beach in San Diego or at a shopping mall in the Midwest. Ocean-inspired designs, puka shell necklaces, what a Gen Zer might call mermaid core, became extremely popular. I was reminded of the mermaid craze recently when a viewer left a comment asking that I do a video on mermaids, particularly mermaids from different cultures. And I had so much to say about this topic that I decided to break it up into two parts. First, we're going to travel back to the Middle East to discover the origins of this folkloric icon. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. The earliest known example of a half-human, half-fish creature comes from Mesopotamia, specifically the Old Babylonian period. This proto-merman is called Kalalu, and not much is known about him. Kalalu is mentioned in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, as one of the 11 monstrous children of the goddess Tiamat. Later Assyrian texts reference a female equivalent of Kalalu called Kaliltu, suggesting the possibility that these female merpeople could have been believed in as far back as their male counterparts, though the evidence isn't clear on that. Another example from the ancient Middle East is the Assyrian fertility goddess Atargatis. Sometimes Atargatis was depicted as half-human and half-fish, though origin myths around her vary. In one version of her story, she falls in love with a human man and bears an illegitimate child. Fueled by shame, she flings herself into a lake. Though instead of dying, she transforms into a half-human, half-fish creature. Her daughter grows up to be the legendary Assyrian queen Semiramis. While Kalalu and Atargatis both appear as mermaids as we would think of them today, neither possess a particularly cruel character. But at the same time that the Assyrians were worshipping Atargatis, the Greeks had their own mythological creature who could use her beautiful voice to lure sailors to their deaths. That creature was the Siren. Sirens most famously appear in the Odyssey. As Odysseus makes his long journey home after the Trojan War, one of the most significant episodes of the text is when he and his crew sail through a region known to be infested with sirens. Odysseus longs to hear the sirens singing, but knows that this would lead to his demise. So he comes up with a plan. He will be tied to the mast of the ship so that he cannot jump overboard, and the rest of the crew will have their ears plugged. Today, if I asked you to picture a siren, you would probably imagine a gorgeous mermaid with a certain murderous glint in her eyes. She is a seductive woman who lures men into the water with her song and then murders them. If you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, then you know that there's a scene that features a siren attack of exactly this nature. You might be surprised to learn that the original sirens were not mermaids at all. Rather, they were creatures that had the head of a human but the body of a bird. And throughout the classical period, sirens were depicted as these half-bird creatures in art. It wasn't until the medieval period that you saw a shift in which the Middle Eastern mermaid creature was conflated with the Greek siren. We don't know exactly how this intermingling occurred, but you start to see this shift in art gradually throughout the period. Keep in mind that in many Romance languages today, the word for mermaid is some variation of siren. Sirena in Spanish and Italian, and Siren in French. By the early medieval period, most of Southern Europe had converted to Christianity, and church authors interpreted the mermaid through a Christian allegorical lens. In their interpretation, the siren used her song to lull the soul to sleep, thus destroying it. They were an obstruction on the path to salvation. Where the medieval mermaid mermaid finds her footing, or rather her tail, is in bestiaries. A bestiary was a text that included moralized descriptions of plants, animals, and mythological creatures. The blueprint for bestiaries was the Physiologus, a text that was written sometime between the 2nd and 3rd century by an anonymous author in Alexandria. The descriptions in the Physiologus were grounded in Christian allegory and were used to instruct on Christian beliefs. It was translated to Latin around the start of the 5th century and provided the framework for the bestiaries that would follow. It's important to note that bestiaries were not intended to be accurate records of natural history. These were allegorical works written by clerics for clerics. Okay, so how does the mermaid fit into this? Mermaids served as a warning for the dangers of lust and pride. When you look at images of mermaids in bestiaries, they are typically holding a comb or a mirror as symbols of vanity. And I've also found depictions of mermaids luring sailors to their deaths. While you'll occasionally see some mermen, the mermaid is almost always half woman. Medieval clerics taught that women were more susceptible to temptation than men. So portraying the mermaid as female fell within the cultural stereotypes of the period. One other thing I find interesting looking at these images is how the mermaid gradually loses her siren features. Some bestiaries have mermaids with bird feet protruding from their fishtails. In others, the mermaids also have wings in addition to their tails. But by the late medieval period, mermaids largely lost their feathers, and they mostly appeared as the half-human, half-fish creatures that we think of today. But in this later medieval period, something else happened. The mermaid was given a romantic makeover. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, Western Europe saw the rise of a new literary genre known as the Romance. The Old French word romans originally referred to texts that were written in the vernacular language of French rather than Latin. The Romance, which was especially popular in, you guessed it, France, as well as in England, generally featured a central chivalric hero, knightly quests, love, sometimes of an adulterous nature, and cultural norms that reflected the customs of feudal societies. An iconic mermaid-like creature of French romance is Melusine, the mythological ancestor of the Lusignan family, who was actually a real aristocratic family. Most famously, Melusine features in The Noble History of the Lusignan Family by Jean d'Arras, which was written in the late 1300s. Melusine is a true good luck charm to her husband Raymond, who is completely unaware of her identity. She bestows castles and riches upon the family, but the marriage comes with one condition. Raymond must never see Melusine bathe on a Saturday. If you've watched my video on the fairy flag of Dunvegan, then you probably recognize the trope of the fairy bride, which was especially common in medieval storytelling. A man marries a magical woman who bestows power, money, good fortune, but it all falls apart when he breaks a rule or ignores a specific taboo. One Saturday, the curious Ramon decides to break Melusine's rule and watch her bathe. He discovers that instead of legs, she has 2 serpent tails. In some art, she is depicted as having wings and fish tails instead of serpents. By the way, if you're familiar with Starbucks' old logo, it comes from a woodcut of the twin-tailed Siren, inspired by Melusine. The medieval romance also incorporates the idea that humans could be turned into mermaids. Before there was H2O, there was the Irish mermaid Liban, introduced in the 11th century Book of the Dung Cow. She begins the story as human, but transforms into a mermaid after her home floods and she is trapped underwater. And that body of water transforms into Loch Ness. So mermaids didn't entirely lose their seductive qualities, but the romance introduced the possibility of a mermaid being the protagonist. Today, we've traced the mermaid all the way from the Middle East to Ireland. But those familiar with the subject know that you can find half-human, half-fish creatures all over the world. In part 2 of this series, we will be exploring global mermaids, as well as how the mermaid became a fairy tale heroine. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments if you have an idea for a future video. Be well, and I'll see you next time.